What's going on, everyone? So I have to tell you about something absolutely wild that went down on First Take yesterday afternoon that had me completely abandoning my work and just staring at the television for over an hour because I could not believe the depth and the intensity of the debate that was happening. And I'm talking about a segment that started off as a pretty standard discussion about the Los Angeles Rams off-season need after their heartbreaking NFC Championship loss to the Seattle Seahawks, but then evolved into this incredibly detailed and passionate argument about whether the Rams should pursue Marlon Humphrey as a free agent to fix their glaring secondary issues. I had just gotten back from lunch and was about to jump into some emails when I turned on ESPN and saw Stephen A. Smith and Shannon Sharpe and Monica McNutt were breaking down the Rams' defensive collapse in that championship game. And at first, I figured it would just be the usual post-mortem analysis about what went wrong and who's to blame. But then, Monica drops this suggestion about Marlon Humphrey potentially being available in free agency and how he could be the perfect solution to the Rams' biggest weakness. And suddenly, the entire panel lit up with this debate that touched on everything from salary, cap management to defensive scheme, fit to whether veteran cornerbacks are worth the investment. Hey, what's up, everyone? Before we dive into everything I have for you today, I need to share something real with you that would mean the absolute world to me. That subscribe button right there. Hitting it right now would bring me one step closer to my dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers. I know you're eager to get into all this content, but real quick, just smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. It's such a simple thing. It takes literally 1 second, but it's honestly the biggest way you can support this journey and help me reach that milestone. Trust me, every single subscription gets me closer to that goal. And honestly, it would mean everything to me. So, do me that quick favor right now and be part of this dream becoming reality. So First Take came back from commercial break, and you could immediately tell this was going to be an intense segment because they had multiple screens set up showing low-light clips from the Rams' secondary getting absolutely shredded by the Seahawks' passing attack in that NFC Championship game, and Molly Karam had this really serious expression on her face as she introduced the topic by asking the panel point-blank whether the Rams can legitimately compete for a Super Bowl with their current group of cornerback. And before anyone could even respond, Stephen A. Smith was already standing up, shaking his head, looking completely exasperated, and Shannon Sharpe was sitting there with his arms crossed, looking ready to go in on the Rams' defensive coaching. And Monica McNutt had this thick folder of papers in front of her that she immediately started flipping through. Stephen A. launched into this absolutely blistering critique of the Rams' secondary and how they got exposed in the biggest game of the season, and Stephen A. was really animated here, pacing around the studio with his hands flying everywhere as he talked about how Jackson Smith-Njigba was running completely free all over the field, catching passes like he was playing against a high school defense. Stephen A. was going through specific plays from that game, showing how Rams cornerbacks were getting beaten on route after route, how there were communication breakdowns that led to wide-open receivers, how the defensive backs looked completely lost trying to figure out their assignments in Seattle's motion-heavy offense. And Stephen A. was making this really passionate case that if you're Sean McVay and you just watched your Super Bowl dreams die because your secondary couldn't cover anybody, your number one priority this offseason has to be upgrading that position group, because everything else on your roster doesn't matter if teams can just throw the ball up and down the field on you whenever they want. And Stephen A. was really emphasizing this point about the NFC being absolutely loaded with elite quarterbacks and elite receivers, talking about how if you're the Rams, you're going to have to face guys like Brock Purdy and Brandon Ayuk in San Francisco. You're going to have to face whoever the Cardinals have at receiver. You're going to have to face DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith-Njigba twice a year with the Seahawks. And how if you don't have cornerbacks who can at least compete with those types of weapons, you're not going anywhere in the playoffs even if you make it there. Stephen A. was saying that the Rams have been living on borrowed time defensively, that they've been trying to patch together their secondary with bargain free agents and late-round draft picks, and that it's time to just acknowledge that approach isn't working, and they need to spend real money on a proven veteran who can actually play the position at a high level. Shannon Sharpe immediately jumped in here, and I could tell Shannon had been waiting for his chance to speak, because he came out swinging with this take about how the Rams are in salary cap hell and can't afford to be throwing money at expensive free agents when they have so many other holes to fill on their roster. Shannon was talking about how the Rams are still dealing with the consequences of all those previous win-now moves, where they traded away draft picks and signed veterans to big contracts, and how they're in this position now where they have limited cap space and limited draft capital, and they can't just go out and sign whoever they want. Shannon was making the case that even though the secondary needs help, the Rams also need help at offensive line, they need depth at edge rusher, they need to figure out their receiver situation with questions about Davante Adams' future, and they simply don't have the financial resources to address all of these needs by throwing money at high-priced free agents. But then Monica McNutt jumped in with what turned out to be the game-changing contribution to this entire debate, and the way Monica laid out her case for why Marlon Humphrey specifically would be the perfect signing for the Rams had everyone in the studio listening intently. Monica started by explaining that not all cornerback signings are created equal, that there's a big difference between just throwing money at any available corner versus identifying a player whose specific skill set and playing style fits exactly what your defensive scheme needs. And Monica started breaking down film of Marlon Humphrey from his time in Baltimore, showing how he plays primarily press man coverage, how he uses his physicality and his length to disrupt receivers at the line of scrimmage, how he has the speed and the football IQ to stay in phase with receivers vertically down the field. Monica was showing clip after clip of Humphrey jamming receivers, using his hands to reroute them off their stem, staying tight to their hips as they work through their breaks, making plays on the ball at the catch point. And Monica was explaining that this style of play is exactly what the Rams need, because Sean McVay's defensive philosophy under whoever they hire as defensive coordinator is built around having corners who can win one-on-one on the outside without needing constant safety help, which frees up the safeties to help in run support or to play more aggressively in coverage. Monica was making the case that Humphrey is one of the few cornerbacks available in free agency who has proven he can handle that kind of responsibility, who has the physical tools and the technique to consistently win his matchups, and who wouldn't require the Rams to completely change their defensive scheme to accommodate his limitation. Stephen A. was nodding along enthusiastically to everything Monica was saying because it was supporting his argument that the Rams need to be aggressive in pursuing quality cornerback. And then Stephen A. jumped back in to talk about the experience and leadership factor that Humphrey would bring to a young Rams secondary. Stephen A. was explaining that when you look at the Rams' current cornerback room, you see a bunch of young players who have talent, but who clearly aren't ready to handle the pressure of playing in big games against elite competition, and that having a veteran like Marlon Humphrey who's been to playoffs, who's played in huge games, who knows what it takes to prepare and perform at the highest level, that presence in the locker room would be invaluable. Stephen A. was really getting passionate here, talking about how championship teams aren't built solely on talent, they're built on having the right mix of talent and experience and leadership, and that the Rams right now are too young and too inexperienced in their secondary to compete with the best teams in the NFC. Stephen A. was saying that signing someone like Humphrey isn't just about what he does on the field during games. It's about what he does in the film room, teaching younger players how to study opponents. It's about what he does in practice, showing them how to work on their technique. It's about what he does in the locker room, setting the standard for preparation and professionalism. First Take then brought in their NFL insider Adam Schefter via satellite. And Schefter started dropping some really interesting behind-the-scenes information about Marlon Humphrey's contract situation with Baltimore and whether he's actually going to hit free agency. According to Schefter's sources, the Ravens haven't made a final decision yet about whether they're going to extend Humphrey or let him test the market. But there's definitely a real possibility that Humphrey becomes available because Baltimore has some serious salary cap constraints and they have other players they need to prioritize for extension. Schefter was explaining that the Ravens are in this difficult position where they'd like to keep Humphrey because he's been such a productive player for them, but they also have to be realistic about his age and his injury history and whether it makes sense to commit significant long-term money to a cornerback who's going to be 29 years old. And Schefter also mentioned something really fascinating, which is that, according to people around the league, multiple teams, including the Rams, have already been doing preliminary research and evaluation on Humphrey in preparation for free agency, and that the Rams specifically are viewed as one of the more likely landing spots if Humphrey does become available. Schefter was saying that the Rams' need for cornerback help is so obvious and so desperate that they're expected to be very active in that market, and that Humphrey's combination of experience and ability and scheme fit makes him an ideal target for what Los Angeles needs. Monica then jumped back in with some detailed statistical analysis, comparing Marlon Humphrey to some of the other cornerbacks who might be available in free agency. And the numbers really highlighted why Humphrey would be such a significant upgrade for the Rams. Monica was showing metrics like completion percentage allowed, yards per target, passer rating when targeted, and in basically every category, Humphrey was grading out significantly better than the corners the Rams currently have on their roster. Monica also showed some advanced analytics looking at things like separation allowed and contested catch rate. And again, Humphrey was near the top of the league in both categories, which demonstrates his ability to stay tight in coverage and make life difficult for receivers even when they do catch the ball. Shannon then came back with a financial argument questioning whether the Rams can actually afford to sign Marlon Humphrey given their cap situation, and Shannon started breaking down what it would realistically cost to bring Humphrey to Los Angeles. Shannon was explaining that top cornerbacks in free agency are getting contracts in the $15 to $20 million per year range, and that at Humphrey's age, and with his track record, he's probably going to be looking for something in that neighborhood on a 3 or 4 year deal. And Shannon was questioning whether the Rams have that kind of money available given all their other financial commitments, and whether it makes sense to allocate that much of their cap to one position when they have needs across the entire roster. But Stephen A. had a really strong counter to this, where he argued that you have to think about value and not just raw salary numbers, that signing Marlon Humphrey for $18 million per year might seem expensive, but if it means the difference between losing in the NFC Championship and winning the Super Bowl, then it's absolutely worth it. Stephen A. was making this passionate case that the Rams are in a championship window right now, with Matthew Stafford still playing at a high level, with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua giving them elite weapons, with their offensive line being solid, and that you can't let that window close just because you're worried about spending money on a cornerback. First Take then showed some film breakdown comparing the Rams' secondary performance in the NFC Championship loss to how they might have performed if they had someone like Humphrey on the outside, and the difference was striking. They showed plays where Rams corners got beaten deep, and then showed similar routes where Humphrey had successfully defended those exact concepts in Baltimore, demonstrating how his technique and positioning would have prevented those big plays. They showed communication breakdowns in the Rams' secondary that led to busted coverages, and then showed how Humphrey, as a veteran leader, helps organize the defensive backfield and prevent those kinds of mistakes. Monica then made what I thought was maybe the most important tactical point of the entire segment, which was about how signing Humphrey would impact the Rams' entire defensive structure and philosophy. Monica was explaining that right now the Rams have to shade safety help over the top constantly because their corners can't be trusted in single coverage, and that this forces them to play more conservatively and prevents them from being aggressive with their pass rush and their blitz packages. But Monica was saying that if you have Marlon Humphrey on one side, who can legitimately lock down his receiver one-on-one, Suddenly, you can free up that safety to do other things. You can bring more pressure. You can play more aggressive coverage concepts on the other side of the field, and your entire defense becomes more dynamic and more difficult to game plan against. Stephen A. then brought up the Davante Adams situation and how that factors into whether the Rams can afford to sign Humphrey, because there have been questions about whether Adams is going to be back in 2026, given his massive cap hit. Stephen A. was explaining that if the Rams decide to move on from Adams and save that $14 to $18 million in cap space, they could redirect that money toward upgrading the secondary with someone like Humphrey. And Stephen A. was making the case that while Adams is obviously a great receiver, the Rams might be better served taking that money and investing it in fixing their defensive problems rather than keeping an aging receiver at a premium price. Shannon pushed back on this pretty hard, saying that you can't just assume the Rams are going to cut Adams, and that even if they did, you can't just automatically apply that savings toward one cornerback, that the team has multiple needs and multiple ways they could spend that money. But Monica came in with an interesting middle ground take where she suggested that maybe the Rams could restructure Adams' contract to create some cap relief while keeping him on the roster, and then use a combination of that savings plus some other cap maneuvering to create enough space to make a competitive offer to Humphrey. First Take then showed some mock contract projections about what a Humphrey deal might look like and whether it would fit within the Rams' cap structure. Their salary cap expert came on and explained that the Rams actually have more flexibility than people think if they're creative with restructures and extension, and that they could probably create $20 to $25 million in additional cap space through various moves without having to make any catastrophic cuts. The expert was saying that if signing Humphrey is a priority, the Rams can absolutely make the numbers work. It just requires them to commit to that priority and be willing to do the financial engineering necessary to create the space. Monica then brought up the injury concern factor with Humphrey, acknowledging that he has missed some games over the past few seasons with various injuries, and that this is a legitimate risk factor the Rams would have to evaluate. But Monica was also arguing that a lot of those injuries were relatively minor and not the kind of chronic issues that would suggest Humphrey's body is breaking down, and that at 29 years old, he should still have several productive years ahead of him if he stays healthy. Monica was also pointing out that the Rams have excellent medical staff and training facilities, and that playing on the West Coast in a controlled environment might actually help Humphrey stay healthier than playing in Baltimore, where the weather and field conditions can be more challenging. Stephen A. then made what I thought was a really compelling argument about the urgency factor and why the Rams can't afford to be passive about addressing their secondary this offseason. Stephen A. was talking about how Matthew Stafford is going to be 38 years old next season, how the championship window with this core is only going to be open for maybe 1 or 2 more years, and how the Rams can't waste that window by hoping their young corners develop or by trying to find bargains in the draft. Stephen A. was saying that when you're in win-now mode, you have to be willing to pay for proven players who can help you immediately, and that Marlon Humphrey is exactly that type of player. Shannon then brought up the alternative options the Rams could pursue if they don't get Humphrey, and Shannon started rattling off other cornerbacks who might be available in free agency or via trade, but Stephen A. and Monica both pushed back on this, arguing that most of those other options are either too expensive, too old, too injury-prone, or not good enough to really move the needle for a team trying to win a championship. They were making the case that Humphrey represents the sweet spot of still being in his prime, having elite skills, fitting the scheme, and being available at a price that's high but not prohibitive. The segment was winding down, and it was time for final takes on whether the Los Angeles Rams should pursue Marlon Humphrey in free agency. Stephen A. went first and said absolutely yes without any hesitation, that the Rams' secondary is their biggest weakness, that Humphrey is the perfect fit for what they need both on the field and in the locker room, and that they should make him their top priority when free agency opens. Stephen A. was saying that If he's the Rams GM, he's offering Humphrey a 4-year deal worth $70 million with $40 million guaranteed, and he's doing everything in his power to get that deal done. Stephen A. put the odds of Humphrey signing with the Rams at 40 to 45% if LA makes a strong offer. Shannon went next and said that while he has some financial concerns and some worries about Humphrey's age and injury history, he thinks the Rams are desperate enough and in win-now mode enough that they probably should take the risk. Shannon was saying that if you can get Humphrey on a 3-year deal with an out after 2 years, that gives you some protection, and that the upside of fixing your secondary and potentially winning a Super Bowl is worth the downside risk of the contract not working out. Shannon put the odds at 35 to 40%. Monica went last and gave what I thought was the most nuanced take, saying that this move makes tremendous sense from a scheme fit perspective and from a need perspective, but that it all comes down to whether the Rams can create enough cap space without gutting the rest of their roster. Monica was saying that if they can make the numbers work through restructures and smart cap management, then Humphrey should absolutely be their top target. But if signing him means they can't address their other needs, then they might have to look at cheaper alternatives. Monica put the odds at 45% and said she thinks this is more likely to happen than most people realize. After watching that entire First Take episode, I'm sitting here genuinely convinced that Marlon Humphrey to the Rams makes so much sense that I'll be shocked if it doesn't happen. Because the way the panel broke down the perfect storm of circumstances, the Rams' desperate need in the secondary, Humphrey's scheme fit with McVay's defensive philosophy, the championship window urgency, the financial feasibility if they're creative, all of it points toward this being one of the most logical, free agent signings of the entire offseason, and potentially the move that pushes the Rams over the top and gets them back to the Super Bowl.